So in the previous video, we understood what a fiscal deficit is. Now, if the total expenditure of the government is greater than its receipts for a particular financial year, then it is known as fiscal deficit. That is, if your expenditure is greater than your revenue for a particular financial year, then it is known as fiscal deficit. Fiscal means one financial year, right? Fiscal means one financial year. Year is from April 1st to March 31st. Okay. For example, it is from April 1st of 2023 to March 31st of 2024. This is a financial year. So if the total expenditure of the government is greater than its receipts for a particular financial year, then it is known as fiscal deficit. Okay. Now let's define the term gross fiscal deficit. Okay. Now gross fiscal deficit is equal to total expenditure minus the sum of revenue receipts plus non-debt creating capital receipts. Okay, this is the formula. The formula is total expenditure minus the sum of revenue receipts plus non-debt creating capital receipts. So debt creating capital receipts are not considered as revenue when we are defining gross fiscal deficit. I repeat, debt creating capital receipts are not considered as revenue when we are defining gross fiscal deficit. So, non debt creating capital receipts are those receipts which are not borrowings and therefore they do not give rise to debt. Okay. Now, debt creating capital receipts, like the name suggests, it means they create a debt. Now, for example, recovery of loans and the proceeds from the sale of PSUs are capital receipts that do not create any debt. So, these are non-debt creating capital receipts. Okay, and this is taken as part of the definition of gross fiscal deficit. So, there are non-debt creating capital receipts, although such receipts do cause a future loss of earning due to the sale of capital assets like PSUs. Right? PSUs are capital assets. Now, if you sell these, that means it cannot earn you money in the future. For example, now let's say you have a house. That house is giving you a rent. If you sell the house, then you get a lot of money, and this is the equivalent of non-debt creating capital receipts. Okay, now you have got money in bulk, but the rent that you were getting every month, now that is lost in the future. So, non-debt creating capital receipts do not create debt, but there is a loss of earning in the future. All deficits have to be financed through one or the other way of borrowing. This is one of the cardinal principles of economics. Many central bankers, even today, they do not look at it this way at all. But the truth is, all deficits have to be financed through one way or other way of borrowing. Hence, the gross fiscal deficit can also be represented in terms of the components of its borrowing. For example, gross fiscal deficit is equal to net borrowing at home, borrowing from RBI, borrowing from abroad. There are only three ways to fulfill this gross fiscal deficit. Any deficit has to be serviced through some kind of borrowing. It can be borrowing at home, it can be borrowing from RBI, or it can be borrowing from abroad. There are only three parts. Now, what are the components of each of this? For example, net borrowing at home includes direct borrowing from the public through debt instruments. For example, the various small saving schemes. This is direct borrowing from the public. Indirect borrowing from commercial banks through the compulsory statutory liquidity ratio. Statutory liquidity ratio we have already spoken about, where the government is supposed to keep a part of its money in very liquid assets like government bonds or cash. Now, fiscal deficit is equal to revenue deficit plus capital deficit, right? Capital deficit is equal to capital expenditure minus capital revenue. This much is very clear. All deficits are nothing but expenditure minus revenue. Now, when we say fiscal deficit, you say it is fiscal expenditure minus fiscal receipt. So, when you say capital deficit, we say it is capital expenditure minus capital revenue. Now, capital revenue is equal to debt creating receipts plus non-debt creating capital receipts, right? So, this is what we have to understand. Capital revenue is equal to debt creating capital receipts plus non-debt creating capital receipts. Hence, taking all of this together, we look at fiscal deficit as revenue deficit plus capital expenditure minus non-debt creating capital receipts. So, these are just different ways of looking at the same term. We are just looking at fiscal deficit and gross fiscal deficit now, and you can express it in many different ways. I hope this is clear. You can also run through the section once again to understand gross fiscal deficit. We will continue from here and we'll look at the term primary deficit. Primary deficit is just the fiscal deficit minus interest payments. Okay, any interest liabilities that the government may have, if you remove that from fiscal deficit, then that is called primary deficit, because interest payments are being made on loans that have been taken in the previous years, and it does not really reflect the deficit that has happened due to spending in the present year. I will repeat this. Fiscal deficit includes interest liabilities, right? Now, interest liabilities come as a result of borrowing from previous years also. So, the fiscal deficit is not showing a true picture of how much deficit has happened due to spending in this particular fiscal year. That is why we use the term called primary deficit. Primary deficit is just fiscal deficit minus the interest liabilities of the government. Now, if you look at the term gross primary deficit, then the term net comes into play, correct? So, gross primary deficit is equal to gross fiscal deficit minus net interest liabilities, minus net interest liabilities. So, net interest liabilities consists of interest payments minus interest receipts by the government on net domestic lending. Okay. So, we have understood the term net before also, where we say net is nothing but whatever you have to get minus whatever you have to give. That is the interest payments minus interest receipts by the government. Okay. So, gross primary deficit is defined as gross fiscal deficit minus net interest liabilities, not just interest liabilities, it is net interest liabilities. So, primary deficit shows you a figure that is more truer for that particular financial year. The goal of measuring primary deficit is to focus on present fiscal imbalances. Interest payment cannot really be stopped and are more of a fixed component that has been carried on from previous years. Hence, measuring primary deficit helps in better understanding the fiscal imbalances due to spending for that particular year. Now, you may ask this question: why run a fiscal deficit at all? Right? We will answer this question in the next video. Thank you.